A distant alien colony was on the edge of collapse and fear hung heavy in the air. The colony had once been full of life. Families built homes under bright skies, children played in the streets, and trade routes carried goods from one end of their world to the other. But those days had faded into a memory. War had come to their planet, and with it came fire, hunger, and despair. The enemy was stronger than they had ever imagined. Their armies marched through cities with no mercy, and their weapons destroyed defenses as if they were made of paper. Every day the colony lost more ground. Every night the people wondered if they would survive until morning. The cities that once stood tall with shining towers now lay in ruins. Buildings burned, smoke filled the skies, and streets were littered with broken machines and broken lives. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, but there were not enough doctors or supplies to treat them. Those who could fight were already at the front lines, giving everything they had to defend their homes. But even they knew the truth. Their defenses were shattered, their armies weakened, and their hope nearly gone. The enemy pushed them closer and closer to extinction. It was not a matter of if they would fall, but when. In desperation, the leaders of the colony gathered. They had few options left, and one of them was to send an SOS into the void of space. They knew it was risky. They knew it was uncertain. But they had no other choice. Their last hope lay in the possibility that someone, somewhere, would hear their cry for help. It was not a message of pride or strength. It was a plea filled with fear and urgency, begging for salvation before it was too late. The message was meant for their allies, the species they trusted. These allies were known for kindness, diplomacy, and the promise of peace. They had sent aid in the past, food, medicine, and sometimes small groups of soldiers to protect weaker colonies. The colony believed that if anyone could come to their rescue, it would be these gentle friends among the stars. As the SOS was prepared, every word was chosen carefully. They spoke of their suffering, their destruction, and their desperate need for help. They spoke of families dying, of children with no food, of cities turning to ash. It was not just a message, it was the last voice of a dying world reaching out. When the signal was launched into space, many of the colony's people looked to the skies with silent prayers. They imagined fleets of their allies arriving soon, ships filled with medicine, food, and supplies. They dreamed of healers rushing to their hospitals, engineers repairing their defenses, and protectors driving away the enemy. For a moment, as the signal left their planet, they felt the smallest spark of hope. But the galaxy is vast, and signals do not always travel where they are meant to go. The chaos of war, the interference of enemy jammers, and the unpredictable flow of space itself twisted the path of their desperate call. Instead of reaching the gentle hands of their allies, the message drifted into unknown channels, echoing across the stars like a lost scream. It traveled far beyond their intended routes, slipping past borders and barriers, until it reached a world that was never meant to hear it. Earth. Earth was a world known across the galaxy, but not with the same reputation as the allies the colony had hoped for. To many, humans were not seen as saviors, but as survivors. They came from a harsh world full of storms, predators, and dangers that shaped them into something fierce. Other species had given them a name whispered with both respect and fear: Deathworlders. Where others would break, humans adapted. Where others would surrender, humans fought with a fury that seemed endless. Their history was full of wars, struggles, and victories against impossible odds. They did not give up, and they did not back down. The alien colony did not know this. As their message reached Earth, they believed they were calling upon peacekeepers and healers. But what they had truly summoned was something far different. Humanity listened to their cry for help, and where other species might have debated, delayed, or sent small aid ships, the humans chose another path. To them, a call for help was not answered with words, but with action. And that action was often made of steel and fire. Back on the colony, the people waited. Days passed with silence. Every hour felt heavier, every battle closer to the end. Some began to lose faith, thinking their message had been lost in the void. Parents held their children tightly, not knowing if they would live to see another sunrise. Soldiers fought on broken fronts with the last of their strength, knowing they could not hold forever. Yet somewhere deep within the colony, hope still flickered. The message was out there. Someone must have heard it. Someone must be coming. They could not know how far their words had traveled or whose ears they had reached. They could not know that instead of gentle healers, they had called upon the fiercest warriors the galaxy had ever known. They could not know that the signal meant to save them in peace would soon bring salvation in the form of war. Their fate had already shifted, and the stars themselves seemed to wait for the moment when Deathworlders would arrive. The SOS, born out of fear and desperation, had left their world like a last breath. It was a cry meant to save them from extinction, but in drifting to Earth it had awakened something else entirely. The humans had heard and they were preparing to answer. The colony, unaware of what was coming, could only wait, clinging to their fragile hope while the universe silently turned toward the next chapter of their story. Humanity received the call and everything changed in an instant. The signal carried desperation, the voice of a dying world crying out for help. For other species in the galaxy, such a message might bring long discussions, committees, and careful debates about what to do. They would ask questions first. Who sent the signal? What risks were involved? Was it worth sending aid? But for humans, hesitation was not in their nature. Once they heard the cry for help, they acted. And when humans acted, they did so with power that shook the stars. Across the galaxy, humanity was not seen the same way as other civilizations. To many, they were called Deathworlders. It was not a title given lightly, nor was it meant as an insult. It was a warning. Humanity's home, Earth, was a planet of storms, volcanoes, predators, disease, and countless dangers. Life there was not gentle, it was a daily battle for survival. From that struggle came a species that learned to endure anything, to fight when there was no chance left, and to turn even disaster into victory. While others grew soft in safe worlds, humans sharpened themselves in fire and hardship. The galaxy never forgot that. The reputation of the Deathworlders was spoken in whispers. Stories traveled among alien traders, soldiers, and leaders. They told of human explorers surviving on worlds where no one else could breathe, where toxic air and wild storms killed machines but not humans. They told of human soldiers who fought wars long after other armies would have surrendered, pushing forward with sheer willpower, even when they were outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly broken. They told of human fleets that did not retreat when battles turned against them, but instead fought harder, often turning certain defeat into crushing victory. To many species this was terrifying. To others it was inspiring. But to everyone it was undeniable. Humans did not know how to give up. So when the alien SOS reached Earth, the humans did not pause to consider the risks. They did not wait to see if someone else would answer. They did not ask if the colony was strong enough to repay them, or weak enough to be ignored. Instead, they treated the message for what it was, a cry for survival. And in their way, survival was answered not with words, but with force. Where others would send ships of medicine, humans sent fleets of war. Where others would first speak of peace, humans prepared for battle. The response began quickly. Orders were given across human space, and fleets assembled with astonishing speed. Warships that normally guarded trade routes were redirected. Carriers loaded with fighters filled their bays. Cruisers armed with heavy cannons powered their reactors. Supply ships packed with fuel, ammunition, and soldiers prepared for the journey. Every vessel, from the largest dreadnought to the smallest escort, moved with purpose. Within days, a fleet large enough to shake a star system had gathered, ready to launch. To humanity, this was their way of giving aid. Their belief was simple. If a people were under attack, the best gift was not only food or medicine, but the destruction of their enemy. They saw no reason to arrive weak or cautious. Mercy, in their eyes, was guaranteed only if the enemy was crushed so completely that they could never rise again. That was how humans defined help. They did not come with words of comfort. They came with fire and steel, because they believed it was the surest way to save lives. Inside human command ships, the atmosphere was tense but determined. Admirals studied star charts, mapping the fastest route to the colony's location. Tactical officers calculated enemy strength, even with little information, preparing for worst-case scenarios. Soldiers trained in the hangar decks, sharpening their weapons, checking their armor, and preparing their minds for the battle to come. The humans did not think of themselves as conquerors. To them this was duty. Someone had called for help and they had answered. But their answer would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen before. In the colonies of other species, word began to spread that humans were on the move. Observers on trade routes saw fleets vanish into faster-than-light travel. Signals leaked from military channels and rumors spread quickly. Some species shook their heads in disbelief. They thought humans were reckless, rushing into a conflict without knowing the full story. Others felt relief, knowing that if they were ever in danger, humans would come for them just as swiftly. and a few trembled in fear, warning that wherever the Deathworlders went, destruction would follow, not just for the enemy, but sometimes for everything around them. But the humans did not care about the whispers. Their focus was on the voice they had heard, the desperate call of a dying colony. They imagined what it must feel like to be abandoned, surrounded, and nearly destroyed. They understood because their own history was filled with such moments.
Humanity itself had faced extinction more than once, by plagues, by wars, by disasters, and each time they had survived.
They carried that memory with them, and it shaped how they acted. To them, leaving a people to die when they had the power to save them was unthinkable. The fleet's engines roared to life, glowing bright as they prepared for the jump into the void. From orbit above Earth and from outposts scattered across human space, ships aligned in formation. Their hulls gleamed with weapons, their banners marked with the flags of Earth and its colonies. It was not just a military force, it was a declaration. Humanity was moving, and nothing in their path would stand for long. The humans knew they were feared. They knew their title as Deathworlders carried both respect and dread. But in this moment they accepted that fear as a shield. If the enemy dared to harm the colony they were going to save, then the enemy would learn what it truly meant to face Deathworlders. And if others watched from afar, then they too would learn a lesson. When humanity answered a call, they answered completely. There was no half measure, no hesitation. As the countdown to launch began, silence fell across the fleet. Soldiers strapped into their seats, pilots adjusted their controls, and commanders gave final words. Somewhere light years away, an alien colony was dying, unaware that help was already on its way. They did not know who would come, nor what kind of salvation they would bring. But soon they would see the sky darken with human warships. Soon they would learn the meaning of Deathworlder aid. And for the humans there was no question, no fear. They had heard the call. They would answer. And they would answer with overwhelming force. The alien colony had waited in silence, their eyes fixed on the skies. Every day they expected to see the familiar ships of their allies, gentle vessels carrying doctors, engineers, and supplies. They dreamed of relief coming in the form of food to feed the starving, medicine to heal the wounded, and protective forces to stand guard against the enemy. Mothers whispered to their children that help was on the way. Soldiers at the broken front lines told themselves they just had to hold on a little longer, until reinforcements arrived. For the suffering colony, rescue meant comfort and healing. But when salvation finally came, it did not look like anything they had imagined. The first sign was a ripple in the atmosphere, a sudden disturbance high above the world. The second was the appearance of massive shapes breaking through the clouds. They were not the sleek white medical ships of peacekeepers, nor the graceful aid vessels the colony knew. Instead, the sky filled with shadows, dark, enormous, and bristling with weapons. The humans had arrived, and they had come not with supplies, but with war. The people of the colony stared upward in confusion and fear. Children pointed at the enormous warships that glided into formation above the planet, their hulls lined with cannons, their engines roaring like thunder. Farmers, workers, and survivors in ruined cities froze where they stood as the clouds split open, revealing fleets of metal titans descending from orbit. Even the soldiers at the front lines, exhausted and broken, stopped fighting for a moment just to gaze at the impossible sight. This was not the relief they had asked for. It was something far more powerful and far more terrifying. Then the thunder began. The human warships unleashed their weapons with a fury the galaxy had rarely seen. Bright beams of energy cut through the darkness of space, tearing apart the enemy fleets that had blockaded the colony. Explosions lit up the heavens, scattering burning wreckage across the skies like falling stars. Within hours, ships that had once dominated the system were reduced to twisted fragments drifting helplessly. Where the colony's own defenses had failed, the humans brought overwhelming firepower, and the difference was undeniable. On the surface, the war was no less brutal. Dropships fell from the sky, carrying squads of armored human soldiers who hit the ground running. With precision and discipline, they stormed enemy positions, destroying fortifications and pushing back armies that had seemed unstoppable. Tanks rolled through ruined streets, firing blasts that shattered enemy strongholds. Fighters screamed overhead, their trails of smoke painting the sky as they bombarded enemy forces with relentless strikes. The people of the colony watched from hiding places, shelters, and crumbling buildings. They had expected healers, but instead they witnessed warriors who fought like storms unleashed. It was awe-inspiring and horrifying all at once. The humans were not here to negotiate. They were not here to comfort. They were here to destroy every threat standing in the way of survival. Entire enemy armies that had terrorized the colony for months were crushed within days. Battles that once dragged on endlessly were ended in a single decisive strike. Cities that had nearly fallen were reclaimed, though much of them lay in ruins after the fury of combat. Where the enemy had held dominance, they now fled in chaos, unable to withstand the sheer force of the Deathworlders. But with the salvation came destruction. Streets shook with the rumble of human artillery. Skies glowed with fire as enemy strongholds exploded. Buildings collapsed in the crossfire, and landscapes were scarred by the power of human weapons. The people were caught between relief and sorrow, for while the invaders were being destroyed, their own world was burning even further in the process. For some, the sight of humanity's war was terrifying. They saw the humans moving like predators, efficient and unyielding, their eyes cold with focus. They saw enemies cut down without mercy, entire units destroyed as if they were nothing. They whispered to each other, were these saviors or monsters? Would they stay once the war was over, or would they leave behind only ashes? For others, there was only gratitude. Families who thought they would never see another day suddenly had hope. Soldiers who had been moments away from defeat now stood tall, reinforced by allies stronger than they had ever imagined. The old, the sick, and the injured saw their tormentors driven away and could finally breathe again. To them, humanity was not terrifying but miraculous. Even if the cost was high, they were alive because of the Deathworlders. Days turned into nights filled with explosions and fire. But unlike before, the sound of battle no longer meant defeat. It meant victory was near. Each sunrise showed fewer enemy forces, fewer attacks, fewer dangers. The humans fought without rest, pushing forward until there was no enemy left to resist. They did not stop until the invaders were broken, scattered, or erased. When the last of the enemy was destroyed, silence finally returned. The colony stood in ruins, its cities scarred, its people shaken, but it had survived. The sky, once blackened with enemy warships, was now filled with human vessels standing watch. For the first time in months, the people could look upward and not feel despair. They had been saved, though not in the way they had hoped. They had expected relief ships. They had expected supplies, food, and gentle aid. Instead, salvation had come wrapped in fire, thunder, and destruction. It was not the rescue they had prayed for, but it was undeniable. They were alive. And they owed that life to the Deathworlders. As the survivors gathered to rebuild what little remained, they spoke in hushed voices about the humans. Some called them heroes, the strongest protectors the galaxy had ever known. Others whispered in fear, wondering if such saviors could one day become conquerors. But one truth was clear to all. When humanity answered a call for help, they answered with war. And that war brought survival, though at a cost the colony would never forget. When the dust finally settled, silence returned to the broken colony. For months the skies had roared with the sound of war. Explosions had lit up the night, and the cries of the wounded had echoed through ruined streets. Now the guns were silent. The enemy that had once seemed unstoppable was gone, crushed completely by the force of humanity's arrival. The people of the colony were alive. Against all odds, they had survived. But as the survivors stepped out from their shelters, they looked around and saw the true price of survival. Entire cities lay in ruins, their towers reduced to rubble and ash. Streets that once carried laughter and trade were scarred with craters. Fields where farmers once worked were burned black by fire. The enemy was gone, but so was much of the world the colonists had known. Victory had come, but it had not come gently. For many, the first feeling was relief. They had been on the edge of extinction, and now they breathed freely once more. Families reunited, tears of joy mixing with sorrow for those they had lost. Children who had been hidden underground could finally see the sky again, even if that sky was still filled with smoke. Soldiers who had fought to the last of their strength now collapsed, not from defeat, but from exhaustion and the strange weight of survival. They looked at the humans and called them saviors. Without them, there would have been nothing left but graves. Across the colony, voices rose in praise of Earth. People spoke of the Deathworlders as mighty protectors, warriors who had come when no one else had. They remembered the moment the skies filled with human ships, the thunder of weapons that had swept away their enemies like leaves in a storm. They believed Earth had answered their prayers, and they gave thanks for that answer, no matter how harsh it had been. Yet beneath the relief and gratitude, Other whispers began to spread. Not everyone saw the humans as pure heroes. Some survivors stared at the ruins and asked questions in hushed tones. Had the humans truly come to save them, or had they come to conquer? The humans had destroyed the enemy, yes, but they had also destroyed much of the colony in the process. Buildings collapsed not only from enemy fire, but also from the sheer power of human weapons. Entire districts had been flattened in the crossfire. Was this mercy, or was it a warning of what humanity could do to anyone, friend or foe? The survivors could not ignore the sight of human warships still hanging in orbit, silent and watchful. They could not ignore the human soldiers who moved through their streets armored and disciplined, their presence as intimidating as it was reassuring. The colony was free, but it was also under the shadow of Deathworlders. And that shadow was heavy. The truth was uneasy. Humanity had not come with soft hands or gentle aid. They had not come with promises of peace or with healing words. Their mercy had been carried in cannons and fire. They had destroyed the enemy so completely that survival was certain, but survival had come wrapped in destruction. For some, this was enough. For others, it was terrifying. Parents held their children close and wondered if the same warriors who had saved them could one day turn against them. Leaders of the colony met in secret, debating what humanity's true intentions were. Would they stay as protectors, or would they demand control? Had they been rescued, or had they been claimed? These questions grew in quiet corners, spreading like smoke among the people. The humans themselves seemed unconcerned with these whispers. They moved through the colony repairing what they could, offering food from their own supplies and tending to the wounded with their medics. But even in kindness, there was an edge of fear. Human medics worked with precision, but they wore the same armor as soldiers. Human supplies fed the hungry, but they were delivered under the watch of heavily armed guards. Everything about humanity's help reminded the colony that these were not gentle saviors. They were Deathworlders, forged by a harsh world, and their way of saving was inseparable from war. Still, one truth was undeniable. The colony was alive. Without the humans, they would have been nothing but ashes. Another forgotten tragedy in the endless void of space. And so the people lived in two minds, thankful for their survival, yet unsettled by the cost. Children grew up remembering the day the skies filled with thunder. To them, humanity became both legend and warning. Stories spread across the galaxy of how the Deathworlders had answered an SOS. Some called it salvation, others called it terror. But all agreed that when humans came, survival was guaranteed, though never in the way one expected, and so the colony rebuilt, carrying both gratitude and unease in their hearts. They would plant crops again, rebuild homes, and try to bring back laughter to their streets, but they would never forget the lesson carved into their history. Humanity's mercy was never gentle, but it was absolute. They had been saved, but the memory of fire and destruction would always remain, a reminder of the terrible, powerful truth of calling upon Deathworlders. Word of the event did not remain hidden. It spread across the stars faster than any fleet could travel. Traders carried the story from one system to another. Soldiers whispered it on distant outposts, and governments listened with both fascination and fear. The galaxy had seen many wars, many cries for help, and many rescues, but this one was different. The colony's SOS had not been answered by gentle allies or peacekeepers. It had been answered by Earth, and the way humanity responded shook everyone who heard of it. Some species reacted with relief. To them, Earth became a shield, a force that could protect the weak and defend those who could not defend themselves. These species looked at the story and saw hope. They spoke of humanity with admiration, saying that when all seemed lost, the Deathworlders had come and crushed the enemy in days. They saw humans as a kind of unstoppable guardian, harsh, yes, but dependable. If another colony fell under attack, if another people faced extinction, they believed humanity would come again, bringing the same unstoppable force. For these species, the Deathworlders were not something to fear, but something to trust. But not all shared that view. For others, the story was a warning, a lesson carved in fire. These species saw the destruction left behind and shuddered. They asked themselves whether humanity had truly come to save the colony, or whether the colony had simply been lucky that the humans chose to fight the invaders instead of claiming the world for themselves. They saw how the colony's cities were reduced to rubble, how the humans had fought with no hesitation, and they wondered, what if the humans turned that power against them one day? To these species, humanity was not a shield but a storm, and no one could predict where a storm might strike next. The story grew with each telling. In one system, merchants told how human warships had blackened the skies with their sheer number. In another, soldiers described human soldiers as relentless, fighting like predators who never tired. Scholars wrote about the reputation of Earth as a death world, a planet where survival meant being strong enough to endure the harshest conditions. To many who listened, it made sense. If humans had grown on such a world, then perhaps it was natural that they fought with such ferocity in the galaxy. The colony itself became a symbol. Whenever people spoke of it, they did so with mixed feelings. On one hand, it was alive, saved from extinction. On the other, it was scarred, carrying wounds that might never fully heal. Visitors who later came to see the colony described a place where gratitude and fear lived side by side. Statues were built in honor of humanity's intervention, but at the same time, hushed voices spoke of the cost of that salvation. It was not a place of simple answers. It was proof of the Deathworlder way. Salvation always carried destruction in its shadow. For leaders of alien governments, the event forced difficult questions. Some saw humanity as a potential ally, one that could guarantee survival in times of war. They began reaching out diplomatically, strengthening ties, and quietly considering how to stay on Earth's good side. Others saw humanity as a danger and whispered of strategies to limit human influence. They debated building stronger defenses, creating alliances against them, or simply avoiding contact whenever possible. The galaxy split into two minds about Earth: protector or threat, shield or storm. From that day forward, sending a signal to humanity carried both hope and dread. Colonies in danger knew the choice. If they called for the Deathworlders, they would live, but the cost was unpredictable. Perhaps their enemy would be destroyed. Perhaps their homes would burn in the process. Perhaps they would be saved, but never in the way they imagined. It was like calling fire to your side. It could keep you warm, or it could burn you to the ground. Among ordinary people across the stars, the story became a warning told to children and a tale told in markets. Some repeated it with awe. If the Deathworlders hear your call, you will survive. Others whispered it with dread. If the Deathworlders hear your call, nothing will ever be the same. The dual nature of humanity's intervention became a truth the galaxy could not ignore. On Earth, humanity did not think of themselves as heroes or villains. They saw only the desperate call for help in their answer. To them, it was simple. Someone had been attacked, so they destroyed the attacker. But the rest of the galaxy now saw something larger, something far more complicated. They saw a species that acted without hesitation, that fought without restraint, and that believed salvation was best delivered through war. The lesson was carved into galactic memory, sharper than any blade. From that moment on, humanity's reputation changed forever. They were no longer just survivors of a death world. They were no longer just explorers or traders in the stars. They became something more, something the galaxy would never forget. If the Deathworlders answered your call, you would live. That truth could not be denied. But another truth followed closely. You would never be the same again. Your world would bear the marks of their coming, the scars of their war and the memory of their fire. Hope and dread became one, forever tied to the name of humanity. And so the story lived on, traveling from star to star, never fading. A desperate colony had cried for help, and Earth had answered. The galaxy would remember that answer for all time.